the Reverend Dr. Bobby Patterson with us again this morning to talk about adaptive resiliency is spiritual practice. This is another session in the series that we've been up to together, discerning God's call in community, the story of self, the story of us, the story of now. We're so glad that each of you have joined us and are looking forward to a couple more sessions here as we continue to think together about what it looks like to discern God's call to us and our community engagement with our neighbors. So Bobby, I will go ahead and share my screen and you can start at your
great. Thanks. We'll leave the PowerPoint for a second. It's always just a real joy to be with my own community in Sunday school. And I'm so grateful for Nicole and everyone who shaped this curriculum. I'll just say that again. Let's just begin by taking a moment to settle into our chairs, whether we've been in church or going to church. Just settle and notice our breath, the prayer of breath, incarnate, alive, resurrected in our bodies. And mindful of the precious creation all around us, which is furnishing this breath, enlivening our bodies, hearts, and minds. And your own precious life, the beauty of your story, your gifts, your willingness to become the body of Christ in the world. And breathing in this precious experience of partnership with others. Community service. The reality of the incarnation risen in us and all beings. Thank you. So what we're going to do this morning is take a look at some concepts that are in a book I wrote about a year and a half ago. And Nicole, you can show that first slide just quickly. This conversation comes out of some of that work, and I know some of you have already seen part of the model of adaptive resilience that we're going to be talking about today, which is such a gift for the kinds of times we're living in with COVID and for thinking about how we engage with others in our daily life, but particularly this morning in service. So the next slide, please, is what I thought we would do this morning is look at this different approach to resilience than what many of us hold. And it comes out of adaptive resilience theory. And we're going to look at a little bit the ways in which this model happens, not only in its kind of simplified form, but of course in real life, it's multi-layered adaptive resilience. And it comes at different speeds according to different layers that we're working in. So resilience in community partnerships and places, what we talked about before, is complicated, but we're going to kind of give ourselves an image that maybe helps us think about that complication, be mindful and aware of it as we're working in our partnerships in resilient, adaptively resilient ways. And then I'm hoping we can really turn to your own story and how this approach has shown up for you when change happens, especially because one of the things adaptive resilience is very focused on is the power, the importance of change in a living system. It can be expected, it can even be somewhat shaped, but it's often unexpected. And then a last little word, if we have time, if we get there, on self-resilience, which is a little bit thicker concept than self-care, that I think we want to advocate for ourselves as a body of Christ. That resilience for us individually is always evolving in our community at Epiphany and with our partners. So that's what we're going to look at this morning. And the first thing is to look at this notion of resilience and why I think adaptive resilience can be different and critical for our work with our partners. So I'm going to just ask, not ask you as I usually would, to kind of think about your own history with what you think service and burnout is, how they relate to each other. And I'm going to suggest in the next slide that most of us have a story in our heads, a kind of older model of service and burnout. If you'll go to the next slide, Nicole, that says underneath that line, if you're really kind of together and working well, then service is flourishing. The life system of your community, community partnership is strong. And in those cases, you have a positive attitude, you're sticking with your commitments, you're holding to the good and not giving up, even when change happens. And in some ways, service like this almost can resist change. It can think we've got to hold things together, lest we move into burnout, lest we begin to fail, things begin to fall apart. And then that's a kind of signal that we haven't really held to our commitments. Our tenacity hasn't been strong enough. We didn't give enough. We didn't do the right things enough, and burnout happens. And with this older model comes the idea that resilient people can keep serving in a same way, in a stable relationship, and not resilient people get involved in collapses or breakdowns. And of course, in service, there will be a resilient moment of stability, but the resistance this model has to break down and collapse is not realistic, actually, for life systems. And that's what we're going to look at in a minute. The idea of serving or burning out, being resilient or not resilient, does have some really strong roots in American Protestant civic service models, kind of the earlier founding models of our country that have, coming out of Europe, coming out of a white experience quite a bit, Protestant experiences, had this sense of real dedication, sticks to it, and does whatever is needed to keep things going kind of as they were. And this became what was called resilience. And that model, of course, I was recently in a conversation with the board I'm on, and a younger African-American member of the board, a doctoral student in psychology at Harvard. He was talking about how African-American communities, Native American communities, Asian immigrant communities don't really quite hold to this either or story about resilience. And he was feeling frustration with, as an African American today, I don't want to hear any more talk about us learning resilience. We know about resilience, but it's not this kind of either or resilience. The resilience we've had to learn with is adaptive. It's always undergoing change because the forces around us are not in our control. And there is a kind of assumption in this model that things can be held in control. And what we're learning about deeper resilience relevant to community partnerships is that with the best intentions, with the strongest love, with the wonderful dinners you all talk about sharing together with partners, all of that still will not prevent things falling apart, because in the next slide is a different model of what a resilient system looks like. And this next slide shows adaptive resilience theory. This is a pretty complicated slide, but it's the simplest version of adaptive resilience theory. And ART, I love it's called ART. ART is now being studied in a major center in Oslo. This model was originally shaped and created by environmental scientists who were looking at natural systems and noting that in natural systems, there are phases of breakdown, and they seemed critically important to the overall adaptive health of a life system. And now the Oslo Center has political scientists, economists, including the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom was working there, sociologists. It's become a broader interdisciplinary center, not just environmental sciences. And so it's about 30 years old, and I have taught classes at Emory with one of the major researchers of adaptive resilience theory. And as we were teaching, and he was teaching our students this, it began to hit me, wait a minute, this has relevance for community partnerships. So I'll just quickly walk us through this model of adaptive resilience theory, ART. And it starts with the top right with that K conservation phase. And this is the phase where things are kind of hanging together. The resources are really in place. They're kind of locked in, and change is very slow. This is the space that often feels very yummy to us because things are stable, volunteers are showing up, the service seems to work, it understands the place context it's in, it's been adapted to that. So it feels like, oh, great, we really, really got it. And there are ways in which that old model of now that we've got it, let's just keep doing everything the way we've done it. In fact, I think in some ways this was Judas's concern. And the great Godspell song Judas sings, what I don't understand, Jesus, is how you've let everything get so out of hand. We had it stable, and now you just keep doing things that keep cracking it open, cracking it open, cracking it open. And the way Amy talked about that mark and ending of even the resurrection is cracked open. It's not held together. But what we've learned about life systems is that conservation phase has its usefulness, but it is not the end game. In fact, continual stability will eventually weaken a system's adaptive capacities. We won't be able to shift when things shift. Emmaus House saw the change of Summerhill and Peoplestown when the Atlanta Stadium came in. It saw another change when Turner Stadium came. It's going through another change. We talked about that before. Now that Georgia State is coming in. And it's very disruptive, but it will also make everyone enrich their commitment to how do we keep our partnerships of community service going. And the same thing happens with Epiphany. People move out of leading these jobs, leading these organizational structures we have for people to be partnering. And when they move out, that's a destabilizing moment. But a healthy life system needs a point, and I like they call it the omega point of release. And this is when things really change, and it's often quite rapid. Sometimes it can be slower, but often it's rapid. And these resources that were kind of locked into a well-functioning service program are suddenly released, and it feels like things have fallen apart. And it can feel like, okay, now we failed to be resilient. But in fact, this is critical. This moment of collapse, of breaking apart, is critical, because this is when things are opened up. In environmental sciences, the classic example is the healthy forest fire, which is not what California has been having. California is having climate change forest fires. They can do still some good work, but the typical forest fire brings so much heat that there are seeds that never pop open without that much heat. And of course, the ground cover is changed, trees fall down, more sunlight comes. The system moves into its next phase, that alpha phase of renewal and reorganization. And now all of a sudden, certain creatures, certain plants that couldn't get into that life system, after a fire, they can. And innovation begins to happen. Kind of new species come, new ideas come in partnerships. It's not that the suffering wasn't real in the collapse. It is real. It's very painful. But in that collapsing moment, what occurs is that boundaries aren't as tight as they were, and innovation is possible. And we actually find ourselves invited to look at the rubble and notice that in the rubble, one way to say it, I sometimes say, is you can rekindle the fire of service, because there are still twigs here. There are still embers that are warm. You can rebuild the fire. Or you can take whatever the resources are that are now scattered and new and innovating, and begin to reconstruct. And that leads to the last growth phase, when you can take advantage now. I never thought about doing it this way. And of course, we've all seen that with Zoom and with the Stations of the Cross at Emmaus House, as well as Anne filming our own. So suddenly there's like, wow, we could use these resources we never even thought of. Maybe Georgia State wants to partner. Maybe there's a particular group that wants to work. Emmaus House will tell us. So this growth phase happens, and suddenly there are even new kinds of resources available. And then you're going to get back to that sweet spot where things are going to hang together for a while, and it just feels so yummy and exciting. And then another collapse will happen. So this is the basic idea behind adaptive resilience theory, that in fact, breakdown is really important for a healthy life system, including service. And all the arrows on this model just show that it doesn't necessarily go in order. It often does, but you may find that you get some R kind of new resources coming in the system, and you're trying them out, and actually it leads to another kind of collapse. It may be a smaller collapse, but it doesn't quite work the way you thought. So you begin to kind of reorganize, try it again. So just to let you know, this is the basic model of thinking of adaptive systems and how they go through phases, and not to panic when things fall apart. It's part of the natural phases in community service as well. And so the next slide says that resilience, adaptive resilience, it's called, the resilience is core to this system, and it occurs in every phase, not just at the collapse phase. Every phase has moments of resilience, because what resilience is doing is it mediates points of stability and instability. And in some ways we can see that, when you have, we do our services online, it feels unstable at first, but the order of service itself, the hymns that Julie, all that beautiful work Julie did for us, it gives us a way of remaining resilient, so that the stability we're used to amid the instability doesn't feel completely overwhelming. Adaptive resilience mediates points of stability and instability. I like to think of it as a kind of frisbee. This is what Lance uses as an example. If you had a flat frisbee and you had tennis balls on top, change is going to happen. So you've got your resilient base and the balls are going to move around. But because of resilience, stability and instability can be together and can continue to change and move. But resilience helps us get through the next phase. It works as a liaison or an arbitrator as we move through the stages. And so when resilience is able to adapt, then a system can maintain its basic structures and functions, but shift as things change, and they will. And this helps all of us reduce our reactivity. And these are all core concepts in Christian contemplative and liturgical life, that we come weekly to worship. We may read our Bibles with regularity. We may pray with regularity. And that means that as we move through life, we have a sense that grace and love are present. That resilience of our faith, of our community of faith, it gives us the strength to move with change without panic, without overreacting. It reduces our reactivity. Now, the suffering is real, just as we've seen through Holy Week. Nothing changed the suffering. Nothing made it go away. But the resurrection is about moving through a process and noticing that there is resilience. There is the love of the Lord all the way through, and we can move forward. And that kind of adaptive resilience is critical for community partnerships, because there just will be breakdown. You all already know this. You all are already committed to this. You understand this. But it gives us a sense of peacefulness, for me at least, of knowing, wow, this is a kind of natural system. This is a way things are in this world. And contemplative practices have always understood suffering is part of happiness. That's how it is. In the next slide, I just want you to see, this is a little bit more complicated model of adaptive resilience, and there are much more complicated models, and this whole thing is way above my IQ. But I want to bring it up here because then I want to do some reflection together. What this model is showing is that even as you're moving through an adaptive resilience cycle, there are some elements in that cycle. They're at a different level, they're at a different scale, and they are very fast and moving into the collapse quickly, while other elements are very large and very slow, and they have memory of what's happened before. Sometimes you can see this, like for instance, with government responses to, I think about the housing complex, Wheat Street Gardens on Auburn Avenue. It's kind of collapsing. It's not being attended to, but government policy around Auburn Avenue and Wheat Street Gardens is slow. It doesn't move quickly enough. It also has memory of the very important aspects of Wheat Street Gardens as a community, and of Auburn Avenue even more, and of the injustice done of cutting Auburn Avenue in half. But the revolt phase means that all of a sudden things are bulldozed, or all of a sudden the kind of organizations that kept Auburn Avenue alive are gone. Even the African-American population is not living there anymore, or the gentrification of the Fourth Ward was fast and quick. So it just to give us a sense that the realities are mixed, but adaptive resilient systems use both aspects, that kind of revolt, shocking change, small and fast, and the larger, stronger memory. So in one way, Epiphany is part of that longer, stronger memory of community engagement and of its own story with Atlanta. While also there's small and fast elements even at Epiphany, when we have new people coming in, people who don't know our service heritage. So both of these things can be happening at once. If you can, Nicole, let's just take the slide down if we can. And just, I'd like to ask you all to just take a minute and think of a time in your service experience when it really fell apart, just really collapsed. And what you, kind of how you responded, what emerged out of that, both with suffering and maybe some good. But just what's been, and if you can think about these different levels being part of it, but that's not necessary, mostly just trying to think of a time when things really fell apart and it felt like, wow, I don't know how we're going to pull this back together. And then what emerged out of that collapse.
I could talk for a minute about our work in Haiti.
That would be beautiful. Is that Lisa, I think?
Yes.
Lisa, let me get my different view on, because I'm seeing Bobby Patterson. What a boring thing. Okay. I'm ready, Lisa, go. Please, that's critical. That's the critical example. Yes,
So,
one of them.
So we thought we were just tooling along and in this 10-year, what turned out to be a 10-year partnership, and almost one day to the next, the partnership changed because our person on the ground who we'd grown to love and work with and trust was replaced. And we thought we should have been consulted with, without any warning. And so all of that is gone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm assuming, Lisa, with that has come a great deal of suffering.
Well, there certainly personal suffering.
Yeah, that counts.
I don't know that we know this. We don't know what's going on really on the ground. So there was suffering before, there was suffering while we were working there, and there's probably still there of course is suffering now, but yes.
That for me, maybe Lisa, correct me, but that may be relevant to the way there's a fast part of that system, just he's gone. And there was suffering that was in the slower part, but there was a sense of we're working on some of that, trying to ease some of that. This fast shift impacts that, but the memory is still there, and the center is still there.
Right. We're just not involved.
Not involved.
I was, what you said earlier about how people of color and others who are not in privilege feel like live day to day with not being in control. That really struck home with me on what happened here with us in Haiti.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think adaptive resilience is a model that more fits the experience of those communities. They're doing it all the time. They have to adapt all the time. And it doesn't mean the suffering isn't unjust or unreal, but this is just, and Grant is just this very articulate, beautiful musician who's smart as hell, and he's just mad. He's mad at the old model. And I think it's an invitation for us to think, oh, okay, I can think of resilience as including collapse and painfulness, but opportunities, as these communities have shown us over and over in the midst of opportunities. Any other examples that you've experience?
Well, I think at Epiphany, the obvious one is the change in leadership.
Yes, ma'am.
Overnight, we suddenly lost both of the people that we thought were
Yeah.
guiding our way, and some of us maybe have been more resilient in dealing with that than others.
Yeah.
And it's an ongoing process, clearly.
Beautifully said, Laura. It is an ongoing process. That's the thing. The system is, and forests get old. And when they get old, they get more vulnerable. So you're right. This is more how things happen. And of course, for all of us, there is that yummy experience. Oh, good. We know we can count on X and Y. They're going to keep our service together, and I can come in and out when I have the chance. And now it's like, actually, that's gone. So we incredibly thank them. We feel with deep care the gratitude for what they've done, but it's also okay. So in that rubble, can we get ourselves in there? And I think the genius of Nicole and the committee shaping this curriculum is that they kind of said to us, okay, into the rubble. What is there? And actually, oh my goodness, there's so much. There's Howard Thurman, there's our capacity to tell our own stories and hear our own stories. There's our capacity to think about place and the richness of places and our involvement with places and the tour of Decatur and even controversy in that, to say, that's not to my mind the only story about Decatur. There's all kinds of stories about Decatur, and just makes us ask more. It pushes us. But the idea that it's not painful is painful.
Well, and I also thought about your example of the forest fire and the natural forest fire and the climate-based forest fire. Priests do leave, and that may be a natural forest fire.
Yeah.
And this sudden departure, is a different kind of forest fire.
Oh, tell it, sister. You're just too on it today, Laura. You're too on it. Tell it, sister. It's a shock. It's a shock. The system is shocked. The pain is real. And so, and then we just have this remarkable, amazing priest and Amy who comes and who starts going through the rubble with us and saying, there's jewels here. There's work here. We can go here. And then so many of you stepping in, but it doesn't mean the suffering isn't there. And that is the first basic of all contemplative traditions, including Christianity, that the things fall apart. And this is how it is in this creation. And the good news is that we can be with that. We can move into that. I always love, and some of you have heard this before, that an image I use in the book is the young man who comes, his life is falling apart, and he goes to the desert to find the great teacher, the hermit in the African desert, who's a deeply Christian practitioner. He finally finds him, and he's so angry that the journey was so hard, because walking in sand is terrible. I've been lucky enough to trek in the Sinai. It's terrible. It's debilitating. You can't keep your feet. You're falling down these sand dunes and feeling like an idiot. It's not like being at the beach. It's very disruptive. It's hot. So he comes, when he finds the hermit, he's at the end of his rope, and he says, what do you do all day out here? And why the hell are you out here in all this pain? And the hermit's response is, here's what we do out here. We get up and fall down and get up and fall down and get up and fall down. And of course, in resurrection life, and when we have our resilience, not expecting things to stay stable, but expecting up and down, then we become less reactive. Oh, now I've fallen. Oh, now the priest has left. Oh, now the people heading service have left. It doesn't mean you don't go outside in your yard and scream and shout and cry and be mad and shake your fist at the Lord, or things have changed in Haiti. But it is about, the gospel story says, yeah, you're going to fall down, but the Spirit, the Trinity, will help you get up, because love is stronger. Resilience is stronger. Resilience can adapt. Love adapts. And that's what we're doing out here. So,
Bobby, one of the things that occurs to me is we have to give ourselves time to grieve what was. And different people grieve at different rates. And so even though new clergy come in and they're presenting profound gifts, some people see those gifts right away. Others, it takes longer because they're still grieving what was.
oh, wow.
And so those are just some thoughts that popped in my head. And
Wow.
the other thing about resurrection, of course, is that you have to die to be resurrected. I mean, you're not going to resurrect a living body that's already alive. We're talking, yeah. And, well, of course, sometimes systems do die. Sometimes things. Sometimes you do have to say goodbye to something, and it's just time for a particular program to end, for example.
Absolutely.
And I'm thinking, 20 years ago, the Old English Festival, if anybody
Oh,
remembers that, that's may or may not be a good example,
it's a
but
good example.
yeah. So
It's a great example, Paul. Thank you for that. And I think as well, that you also talked about the different phases, slow and fast. And I'm seeing the chat. I'm going to weave some of that in, but the slow and fast stuff is, some of us are relating to the pain of change slower. And that's a precious element of the system. And some, okay, move on. Let's move on. My spouse likes to say of me, if it happened 2 minutes ago, she's not interested. I am definitely a person who, I like to move on. I like the next thing. And there's weakness in that. So of course I married someone who's very committed to history and memory, and what about remembering? So those are important. I think the other thing I want to say, and then I can look at the chat, is you mentioned things stop. In adaptive resilience, that's called a flip. The system flips. Some systems can take tremendous change and the basic cycle keeps going. But the example that Lance, my colleague at Emory, he was for many years at the University of Florida, and his expertise is the Everglades, and he was actually the major scientist, environmental scientist for the US government on the Everglades. And one thing that happens in the Everglades that really convinced him of adaptive resilience is you have a little area of the Everglades, and let's say some are salt, some are fresh, but let's say you have a freshwater area. That means certain plants are there, certain bird life is there, certain animal life is there. You can do certain kinds of fishing. And that freshwater area experiences, call it a hurricane, call it human construction. They're building a suburban neighborhood next to it. No amount of permits stopped it. Then you have an invasion of salt water, and the system flips. And now it's a saltwater system. And for some people, the loss of the freshwater system is so devastating. They just, and of course the Everglades in 25, 40 years ago tried to get it back. Well, now we're going to build walls. We're going to keep the ocean, more ocean from coming in. We're going to keep it all fresh water, And it doesn't really work. The system is already flipped. So it is important to know sometimes even in this model is prepared for a flip. And all it means is the adaptive resilience cycle will continue, but now with a saltwater system. Now we're not doing this Old Bart's Festival. And like I said, now the Peachtree Pine Center is not happening. And it's painful. It's a definite loss, but it's not happening. And I'm going to go back to and Aaron saying, yeah, or you have something like Gateway not really able to be a ministry because the pandemic makes doing anything for service impossible. And that's painful. Any more to say, Aaron, on that?
I was just thinking that the examples from Epiphany are a lot of them having to do with leadership changes, and certainly the transition from Claiborne and the interim year was not without its chaos and disruption and difficulty. And even in our committee life, it feels like we are trying to move towards a model where we can be adaptive, we can be resilient, because even with outreach, for example, Lisa and Bev were chairs for so long and there was no one coming in behind them. And they finally said, okay, we retire. And it's a chance for true, that is a disruption, but it's also, we need to build something out of that rubble. So it can be an opportunity in a way.
Oh, yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said. And I'm thinking, Nicole, that I know church is calling, and maybe if you'd put up one more slide, and if you need to go, I don't know, Paul can help us shut it off. This is kind of so first of all, just right, that just to notice, Aaron, what you were saying really fits that model of remembering the fast and slow dimensions. And it can be even many more scales. Every time we do anything in this city, it depends who the mayor is, who's on the city council. There's lots of factors in our own committee life too. So that memory fast change is always happening. But in the next slide, just to say, it may be that we simply need more time to be in with more deep spiritual honesty. How much has happened to this parish? Some, for some of us, it goes way, way back. For some of us, it's newer, and we have to recognize that. But we may need to move into the reorganization phase with some kind, generous slowness. Or some may move faster into it, and it can be a smaller thing that they're working on. But when we move into the change, whether it's in into the collapse phase or the rebuilding phase, or there's a better word than exploitation. That's the word they use. But anyway, the kind of creativity phase, you might say. Our Christian contemplative traditions, and I can another time make it more explicit, but some of the basics they say is that when change has happened, the first thing to do is kind of drop your assumptions about what has to be. And the disciples just said, I'm out of here. And I get that. I feel like I would have done that. I'm out of here. And their assumptions were still kind of, it was supposed to happen this way. And of course, Peter's the best example. He's just, Now, I was once at a retreat. This is kind of silly, but a long time ago in a big Roman Catholic women's lay order farm in Ohio. Oh, what's the name of that place? Anyway, we did some imaginative work around the resurrection stories, and we did a skit And what emerged was the women were gathered in a place, us, and the men were hiding and maybe talking to each other after Jesus's death, and he's in the tomb. And the women started the hypothesis testing. We got to get the men in gear. We got to keep the gospel going. And then one of the women in our skit said, remember that thing when he had that last meal with everybody and he was saying those strange words and doing that foot washing stuff, and like, I don't know what that's about, but why don't we cook a meal and we'll go find the men and we'll share a meal, and then we'll try to remember whatever it was Jesus was saying about this is my body and here's wash each other's feet, and let's just try that. And it was an example of, wait a minute, we have stuff we can work with. How can we hypothesize the next step? The second thing contemplative traditions always do is say, ask a body question first. That's the incarnation. Don't think about it solely. It's not that the mind isn't important, but it's the heart mind. It's the body, heart, mind that works. So, if you see service collapsing, you better spend some time feeling it in the body. And it might be pain, it might be anger, it might be numbness, it might but go to the body before you start figuring it out. And I think Paul and many of you are aware of this, and you all have incredible wisdom. And of course, Nicole and Amy do. And then the last thing is embrace the change, as this is the sweet spot. And you don't have to hurry, but it's not stability, that's the sweet spot. The incarnate sweet spot is change. And that's what we're doing every day in Christ. We're transforming. And it's deeply gratifying if our intention is to love God, self, and neighbor. And it's very hard. It's very hard. And service right now is not simple. It never has been, but it's really not simple now. And for Epiphany, it's not simple. But I think adaptive resilience gives us a way to draw on our Christian heritage and move into the change and take the time we need. And some of us may be faster and some of us may be slower. I really appreciate you all. And some of it is about mourning that a system has flipped. It's just not the same. And there's no getting it back. And there was no getting it back after the resurrection. There's no getting it back. That was the thing, the guys on the road to Emmaus are like, how can we get it back? Well, I'm here. I don't look the same. You've got it back, but it's not the same. Okay. So I hope this might be useful for us. And I think it's so profoundly able, and you've all shown it, to be in our stories. Our own individual stories know this, personally in our personal life and in our service in churches and at Epiphany. But then it scales up to groups who did, like Lisa, who did the committee for years, and then others who have this long history at Epiphany, and then our community partners and the Decatur Cooperative Ministries, and it's multiple scaled. And you have to be generous. We have to be generous with ourselves.
Bobby, I thinking about your Everglades example and trying to build the walls and keep out the water and all of those things. And I think the longer we're part of a system and we've seen prior change take place, the less we feel that need to try to get it back and build the walls. And the more we can say, I wonder what's going to come this time.
Yeah.
I think our experience with the system is part of how we learn to be more adaptive.
Oh, beautiful.
I think the first time we think, oh man, it's all gone to hell, and we just jump and run,
Oh, that's so beautiful, Nancy. It's so beautiful. And I can be a very slow learner in some areas. There's some things I'm just totally tenacious about holding on to. And other things I can let go, but that is such a great truth. Yeah. The gospel is adaptive. That is indefatigable. It's indefatigably adaptive.
All right, Dr. Bobby, what does that mean?
It, it means that the love of God is so steady, nothing shakes it. Nothing shakes it. Taking all the time you need to mourn something that happened 20 years ago, okay, the gospel can take it.
It doesn't
Losing,
fatigue.
huh?
It doesn't fatigue.
It doesn't fatigue. Doesn't fatigue. And it's tenderhearted. It's tenderhearted. So we don't, we go together because we are the body of Christ. And some of us are slower and some of us are faster. And some of us see it one way and some of us see it a different way. And the kingdom of God is mightily hampered if we disrupt that diversity.
I've been in numerous churches, which more than a few, there's always a group of people who remembers a golden age, and I feel like, just to bring St. Bart's up again, that parish, the identity of that parish was so fused with the Old English Festival. I wouldn't be surprised if there's still some of that going on over there, and they've been going through all kinds of additional changes since then. But our memories of the golden age, they're never accurate anyway. And so spending a lot of time and energy on that takes you away from time and energy that you could, it's like, how anxiety is always about the future. Well, you're not dealing with the present if you're always looking back and reminiscing about a golden age or what was. Some more thoughts, I guess.
Yeah.
But I've seen that in numerous churches, when so-and-so was rector, or when this was going on, or when that was going on. Those were the good old days.
Yeah, it's pretty human. It's full. The Bible is full of it. The Psalms are full of it. When are you going to get David back on the throne? It's the power of the Roman Church that just will not buckle to certain things. The Roman Catholic Church my brother is beautiful memory, a member of that. It ain't buckling on certain things, and they have their place, but it's also very innovative, and that's the tension of the gospel. And we are being called always, like you and Nancy are saying, to renew and innovate, and that is core to the message, especially of the resurrection. But I think what we can do is live with some of these thoughts. And I love the idea of our stories and kind of getting clearer about our stories and how they become an epiphany story and match with the stories of Emmaus and other places. And those are changing, they're life changing, which is why the gospel it's just the stories of what happened. And by the way, they're different versions of the story in the gospel. They're not the same story. Yeah, and that's good. That's good. That's good. I think we better go.
One of my mother's gifts to me was her mantra, make peace with reality. And that it's coming to mind this morning with resilience.
Yes,
Um,
yes, yes. Yes,
and, you know, in the Everglades, make peace with reality. At Epiphany, make peace with reality. After the death of someone, make peace with
That's right.
reality.
yeah, yeah. With kind-heartedness. Absolutely, Laura. My mom's version to me was get with reality. Barbara, you need to get with reality, Barbara. Her great psychiatric social work training, but with kindness and tenderheartedness and very clear justice, but tenderhearted. Yeah. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Nicole, for this
Thank you,
wisdom.
Bobby.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you,
Thank
Bobby.
you.
great to be together.
Thank you so
Bobby.
much.